Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at cultivating psychokinesis from a unique perspective because we'll be exploring the research that I did with a talented psychokinetic subject named Ted Owens, as reported in my book, The PK Man. And with me in the studio is Debra Lynne Katz, who has an unusual background as a researcher, twice the recipient of the Warcollier Award from the International Remote Viewing Association for an outstanding research proposal. She is also the president of the International School of Clairvoyance. She is a gifted psychic reader and a remote viewer, and the author of several books, including You Are Psychic, Extraordinary Psychic, and Freeing the Genie Within. Welcome, Debra.
Thank you, Jeff. Great to be here.
It's good to be with you. And one of the reasons that we set up this interview together is because you've taken a particular interest in the PK Man and the training of the PK Man.
Yes, the first time you talked about Ted Owens, I was just fascinated. It seemed like such an incredible documented case, and you did such a fantastic job writing the whole book and really showing that this wasn't just about taking a person who had these experiences and believing him, but you really approached this from a very intensive research perspective. What was that like for you?
Well, I worked with Ted for 10 years, from 1976 until his death in 1987. I started that work as a graduate student myself. I was in my late 20s at the time, and when the work began, and I was very eager and energetic. I first heard about him when I visited Stanford Research Institute. Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ had invited me there to learn remote viewing. As a matter of fact, I did a remote viewing session with them in February of 1976, and at the same time they had this big file of papers, and they said, this strange fellow Ted Owens has been badgering us. And they said, we know he's got real abilities because he ended a drought here in California for us. And Russell Targ said, and I wrote back to him and I told him that was a good prediction. And he wrote back to me and he said, hell no, that was no prediction, I caused it. And then they said, but you know, we're getting into so much controversy with our research with Uri Geller, which had been published in Science or Nature magazine at the time. They were getting a lot of publicity. They said, we can't afford to have another controversial psychic associated with us, so would you mind taking this case on? And they gave me all of their files and sort of dumped it in my lap as a way of getting it out of theirs.
And there's so much to talk about with him. Mm-hmm. Could you give us a few examples of the point where you really believe that he may really have these abilities?
Well, you know, when Puthoff and Targ told me right off the bat that there was this drought, and I knew about the drought, it was going on in the Bay Area at the time. People were rationing water, and the newspapers in Palo Alto that Russell and Hal showed me talked about the drought ended within days of Owen saying he would end the drought. But not just that. He said, I'm going to end it in a way you'll know it was me, because I have signatures that you will recognize. They will include weird weather, heat, sleet, hail, snow, which is very rare in the Bay Area, and he said there'll be UFO sightings as well, and power blackouts. All of that is part of his signature, and that's what happened. That's what was reported in the newspaper. So at that time, I was already a student of parapsychology, and I have to say, it's hard for people to appreciate what it was like back in the 1970s, but it seemed as if the research being done in parapsychology was going to change the world. There were two things that looked like they would change the world. One was computers, and the other, to me, was parapsychology. And I can look back and say, yes, computers did. Since the 1970s, they changed the world. The internet was just starting at that point. But progress in parapsychology has been much slower. And it's not that the phenomenon aren't real. Ted Owens produced over 160 demonstrations of his abilities, 2/3 of which produced dramatic results, but it's more than people can digest. Mm-hmm. And so even now, 30 years nearly after his death, I'm still talking about it because I think, people are just starting to have the capacity to appreciate what might be possible with regard to the human mind.
So can you give us a couple examples? Now, I know you were with him a lot. You were actually at locations with him.
Yes.
So out of all those examples, what are the ones that really stick in your mind where you yourself saw the phenomenon?
Well, no, to be honest with you, Deborah, even though I was with him on occasion, he dealt with large-scale phenomenon. So I wasn't necessarily present when they occurred.
But he would call you up and say, this is going to happen, and
yes.
This is the way it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then it was interesting in the book because you would not just, even after it happened, then you would set up a control group.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Well, for example, he told me that he wished to produce an effect for me. And I was very happy that he was willing to work with me, and I knew that in the historical records he had shown the ability to produce UFO sightings. I thought that would be neat. So I said, do that for me, and he said, okay. Without giving me any time to prepare, he said, I'm going to make 3 UFO sightings happen within a 100-mile radius of San Francisco. And so I thought, good. But how do I know UFO sightings aren't happening everywhere all the time anyway? So I contacted a group of fellow graduate students at the University of California, San Diego, similar metropolitan community, and I said, would you monitor the San Diego area in the next 90 days, and we'll use that as a control to see if any UFO sightings occur. And there were 2 significant sightings, at least 2 in the Bay Area, not 3 as he had promised, but 2, and none in the San Diego area. So that was a control, but in retrospect, this kind of research does not lend itself well to the experimental method.
But at least that demonstrates that you were trying, right?
I did, yes,
yeah,
I did what I could as a graduate student, but I couldn't publish any of these results in any scientific journal. It was not possible to get the proper statistical database regarding the kinds of events he worked with: power blackouts, hurricanes, tornadoes, hot spells, cold spells, sporting events. Well, the sporting events probably come the closest to those that might be analyzable in a statistical manner.
But then you would follow up, you would contact newspapers and radio stations to find out exactly what happened with the weather. It wasn't like you just took his word that it worked.
Well, as a matter of fact, he did a lot of that for me. He'd say, I'm going to concentrate on this event or that event, and he'd send me the newspaper clippings. I would have, and I still have, postmarked letters from him on a particular date saying, I'm going to cause this event using my psychokinetic powers in conjunction with my space intelligence friends, invisible other dimensional beings who hover over the earth in a large, gigantic UFO. And then he would send me the newspaper clippings showing that these things had in fact occurred. He just cut them right out of the newspaper. They're easy to verify. They're still on the record. All these documents, I have several file drawers full of these documents. So he was easy to work with. He was trained in parapsychology as a research assistant for J.B. Rhine back in the 1940s. So he understood the importance of documenting what he could do. He wanted nothing more than to have a group of supportive scientists working with him to harness his abilities for the betterment of humanity.
And did he ever get that? I mean, he had you studying him, but did he ever get his dream of people saying, hey, let's come together? And
he had a small coterie of true believers who supported him financially. Some people were working class people who gave whenever they could, and there were occasional wealthy benefactors, but by and large, no, certainly not from the government. And I was the closest contact in the scientific community. There might have been one or two other individuals who took him seriously, but by and large, people were either in total disbelief that someone could have these abilities, or they were frightened. I once organized a gathering of scientists to look at the data, and I arranged for the famous UFO researcher, J. Allen Hynek, to come to that event. And he got there and he said, I wouldn't touch Ted Owens with a 10-foot pole, even though he had shown an ability to produce UFO sightings. He said, whatever he's doing, it's a product of the unconscious mind. He's a loose cannon, and I want nothing to do with him. And that was a friendly response.
And as far as being a loose cannon, could you talk about that? Would you agree with that assessment?
He was a very difficult personality to deal with, but I think anybody who put themselves out the way he did, who said, I can do this, watch me. You know, if you don't believe me, just watch. And he would do it, but people got angry at him, and they said, you're a phony, or you're doing the work of the devil. In fact, he was a healer back in the 1950s, using hypnosis for healing, and the American Medical Association tried to put him out of business. It was a big blow to him personally, and there were many letters of testimony as to how people were healed. But after the AMA shut him down, I think he developed a bitterness inside and a desire to teach people lessons when they treated him rudely. I think the one lesson I've learned from all of that is to treat everybody with respect, because you never know who might have psychokinetic abilities.
And I once heard you talk about an incident where he got upset with you and you felt that he may have had an impact.
Yes, it happened, Deborah, because after this amazing UFO sighting that occurred as part of the San Francisco demonstration in 1976, where he told me he'll create a UFO, it will be seen by hundreds of witnesses, it will be photographed, a photograph of it will be published on the front page of one of your local newspapers, and that happened. But he had also told me he would create 3 UFO sightings, and at that point in time there were 2. So he was on the phone with me, and he was going on about what a great job he had done producing this incredible, the best attested UFO sighting in history at that point, probably, although it never got into the annals of the UFO people. But I said to him, well, Ted, you haven't done everything that you said you were going to do.
Oh, no.
And at that point, he got very angry, and he slammed the phone down. And I was feeling fine at the time, but within half an hour, I began to get a sore throat. And you know how you get that feeling like, uh-oh, I'm going to get a cold. This is like, my throat is so scratchy, I know what's going to happen now. And I was expecting it was going to get bad. And then, about an hour later or so, I was feeling pretty sick. He called me up, and without explaining anything, he said, Jeffrey, I'm sorry. I promise I will never do that again.
Uh-oh.
And within 15 minutes, everything lifted. I felt fine.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So one of the things I thought would be really interesting to talk about, a lot of times conversations like this get into did it really happen and the proof. But let's say everything he was saying was true and that he was guided by this alien intelligence. Can you tell us, because he's no longer here, so you're the voice for him now, what were these alien beings like? Can you give us a physical description?
Well, he described them as, if you were to see them physically, as being like giant grasshoppers, and they made high-pitched, squeaky sounds, and he called them tweeter and twitter. He also said that they had the ability to appear to you in different forms, and that they could appear to you as an energy being, so you wouldn't have to, if you would be frightened by the idea of a giant grasshopper or praying mantis kind of insectoid creature. That's what he said they were like. And he said they sat in their big, giant, invisible UFO above the earth, and they had a big, TV screen that they looked at, and he would project mental images to them, and they'd see it on that big screen, and then they could, create whatever effect he asked them to produce. He said that they had been watching him his whole life, that as a child he had shown a lot of psychic potential, including levitations, but that they arranged to abduct him and operate on his brain and give him extraordinary powers so that they could do some research and see how the human race would respond to a person like him.
So he would project a mental image out to them, showing them what he wanted to have happen, and then how would they communicate back to him?
Well, he claimed that during his life he held many different professions. He was a jazz drummer, he was a high-speed typist, he was hired as an idea man by a railroad, he was a shorthand expert, he was a bullwhip artist in a nightclub act, and he claimed that they guided him to have all these different professions so that his mind would be flexible enough to be able to communicate with them telepathically. I can't say much more than that, but what I would like to do, since you have taken an interest, Debra, in the training program and have actually listened to some of his tapes that are available to people from the training that I took with him in 1986, maybe you have some feeling for it.
Well, I've been listening to those tapes, and I find I fall asleep pretty much as soon as he says you're going to go into a deep sleep, I go into a deep sleep. But what I can say is for the first couple ones, as soon as the tape started, I started to have imagery, just bombarded by images, which doesn't tend to happen to that extent when I listen to a lot of audio programs. And the images were very unusual. I'd say they would have been disturbing. They didn't totally surprise me given that I had read the book, but they're just images like there was an angry dog that had its back to me, and then he turned his head and just kind of looked at me in an arrogant way and then kept going. And there was another beings that looked like strange animals, like half turtles, half eagles, just strange. And the thing that stood out was that there seemed to be some kind of awareness with them. Images don't usually, clairvoyant images are just usually just like watching TV. They're not turning their heads and looking back at you when you watch TV. Some kind of awareness. So there's just a lot of this, and some of it I might consider lower astral type, what you would think of just kind of a whole bunch of garbage type things. But now he had a lot of different phenomenon happening besides for all this.
In fact, he claimed that he was being hounded by poltergeist activity around him, and I believe him when he said that, as family members attested to much the same, that there were always strange things going on. I'll even say this. I had at one time a student working with me to organize all the files and papers, and the student had a filing system, and he took all of this home with him to work on it. And he reported back to me that one night he had left everything and he went to bed, and when he got up in the morning, back in his living room where all of this material had been kept, it was scattered all over, like a poltergeist had come and just thrown everything around. So, you know, dealing with psychokinesis, it's like this irrepressible force, and you don't always know what it's going to do. It's often very unpleasant for people who have spontaneous psychokinetic activities going on around them. Very few people are good at controlling it. And then, on top of all of that, you have a strong segment of our population, the fundamentalist Christian community in particular, who would say this is all diabolic. Mm-hmm. It's the work of the devil. And I think that your imagery of the angry dog reminded me of many of images I've seen at temples in Asia of figures that I would call daemonic, not demonic. The meaning is a little different, but it's a powerful psychic force associated with the devas or deities. Not always positive, but not necessarily evil in the Christian sense of satanic.
And he would sometimes hear growling noises. Can you talk about some of what he reported, and also was it ever verified?
Well, the only verification was from his own family members who were with him at the time. And indeed, they attested that these things were going on. Growling noises, like sightings of creatures and so on. It was just part of his world. And
did this disturb him at all?
Yeah, I think he was bothered by it. I think he didn't always get enough sleep at night. I think, you know, I don't encourage people to cultivate psychokinesis in general. I think it may be a little bit more than most people can handle. I know in your case, I thought, given your background as a student of lifelong student of psychic functioning, and a person who seemed to have I would say maybe a spiritual or a soul calling to explore this, it felt okay. But you're one of the rare people whom I've ever thought ought to look into cultivating psychokinesis.
Yeah, and it's a shame I haven't been able to stay awake for any of his tapes, so maybe, I know you've listened to them several times. Can you tell us, what is the core of the training? Can you give us a couple techniques that he gave you?
The training is all, I have to say, very positive. It involves a lot of positive affirmations. It involves many visualizations of being in communion with nature, being in communion with the deity, having sacred spaces one can go into to communicate with nature and with a divine being. It involved working out kinks and wrinkles in your own personality and being able to see the world clearly and without having any cloudiness in your understanding of things. So all of that was 100% positive. And when I asked him about it, and I said, well, are you using hypnosis to help cultivate these abilities? He said, well, that's only the beginning, because he said what he was really doing is using his own psychokinetic abilities in the training with the help of the space intelligences, that you needed their cooperation. And he said most of what was going on in this training was coming from them and from his own PK, which is the parapsychological abbreviation for psychokinesis.
And did he talk about why him? Why would the space aliens choose him for this?
He claimed he was the first person they had found since Moses who could wield this kind of energy, who was able to handle it. And frankly, you know, knowing the history of parapsychology as I do, and as my co-author of the original draft of the book, D. Scott Rogo, was a real expert on the history of parapsychology, there doesn't appear to be anyone else who has been studied who has exhibited that range of large-scale phenomenon, although it's not unknown in, say, the literature of shamanism. I'm inclined to think, since we only have a minute or so left, Deborah, to wrap things up, to say that this is a natural human talent. This is something that someday in the distant future, many people will probably be able to cultivate and express, and that we can integrate this deep mysterious talent into our technological society. I think eventually that will happen.
Well, and for all we know, since I really believe that our psychic abilities are happening to us all the time without our awareness, it's very possible that the same things he was doing was happening as we're already doing this, just subconsciously.
J.B. Rhine used to point out that every time we, of our own volition, do something like, I can raise my hand, that's psychokinesis. That's mind over matter right there. That to be able to do that outside of the body is, the next level, but it's only a step beyond what we all do all the time anyway.
Yeah, and Ted, the one thing that strikes me when I listen to him is that he seemed to have such a sense of confidence. Was he always that confident about what he was doing?
Well, I'm told in the shamanistic literature that sense of confidence is necessary, that you have to totally believe, really, really believe that you can do it. And that's what makes it happen. Well, our time is up, Debra, but thank you so much for being willing to share this half hour with me on this most unusual and I think important topic.
Yes, and I hope people will go out and read the PK Man. It definitely deserves to be read from cover to cover.
Thanks, Debra. And thank you for being with us.